there. Welcome to Raising the Barre. This is our online leadership curriculum. I am delighted today to be introducing Shannon Riggs, who is a managing partner at Finn Partners. Shannon, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Liza.
I'm very excited. So Finn Partners has grown really quickly. I was doing my due diligence. Y'all just started in 2011. Tell us a little bit about the firm and then tell us a little bit about you.
Absolutely. You are correct. We have grown very rapidly. But as you saw, we were founded in 2011, but we brought together a number of organizations that were already established and really best in class in the work that they were doing, whether that was public relations, integrated marketing, digital, you name it. We really came together and brought our expertise together because we felt we could create a better organization for our clients, one that was dedicated to our people, dedicated to being able to provide full service solutions. And that's really where Finn Partners is today. So we provide global services. At times our projects are narrowed in on communications or advertising or a different component, but oftentimes we're looking at the full picture.
Okay. And today, obviously, we're talking about crisis communications. So before we get into what that actually is, tell us a little bit about you.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, so I'm managing partner out of our Portland office. My experience has been across the board. I actually started in health communications, but before I joined the agency, I did. Absolutely. I worked in tobacco prevention and control for many years on the youth tobacco prevention and control side. And then with my work with Finn Partners, I work with everything from everyone from nonprofit organizations to Fortune 500 companies. Certainly we prefer to help our clients through the good times and moving forward, but the reality is there's always crisis situations that come up, and some of them are ones that we cannot even avoid no matter how much planning we do. So it does become a very prominent piece of the work that we do, as well as protecting our reputations as an organization in the good times and the hard times.
Okay, so as you and I discussed a little bit offline, Raising the Barre was started originally. The idea is to prepare women for leadership roles, and in specific, we're focused on part of the reason that we don't put up a paywall, we don't require subscriptions, and thank you again for doing this for us. More of a public service because we really want to diversify the candidate pool coming in. But as we proceeded with this, as we started to talk to folks, including recruiters, candidates themselves, and looking at existing organizations, it became clear that the board members themselves need training, and sort of in-house stakeholders really need a better sense of what to do when things go wrong. So first place I want to start is, what is a crisis?
That is a great question. Oftentimes when we think about crisis, we think about really big situations. Somebody got hurt, or the financials are crumbling, or somebody did something that we never thought they would do. And oftentimes that's where our minds go. The reality is a crisis is anything that could negatively impact either the reputation or the financial standing or well-being of your organization. So there are really two different types of crises that we focus on. One is the natural crisis. Could be an earthquake, flooding, hurricanes, those ones that we can't control, but we absolutely are impacted by. There's also human-related crisis. Now that's where it comes into, maybe it is somebody who was a bad actor and we didn't see it coming, or made a poor decision, or there was an injury, and not an intentional, but the injury does have a negative effect on the organization. So those are really the two different types that we look at. And then I'll just say within there, when you have those two different crises, whether or not we respond or how we respond can change as well, from whether or not it's a small crisis or if it is an escalating crisis.
Which we'll talk about in part. So you mentioned sort of acts of God like the pandemic, which has been a huge crisis for the performing arts sector. As you may or may not be aware, dance in particular, but the performing arts in specific, have a long, sad history of bad conduct, sexual assault and harassment, grooming of kids, etc. And to date, I haven't seen an example of a forthright, transparent response. And of course, we do understand that given how the legal system works in the United States, everybody has a tendency to turtle, to just or close their eyes, stop their ears, and go, no, 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 and pretend that it's going to go away. There's also been a real lack of accountability on any level, including, sort of operations and finances, et cetera. So we really are swimming upstream, but I think that's why your advice is so necessary. So I would assume you're going to tell us that if the crisis has already happened, you're kind of on the back foot and you're already too late. So let's talk about the ideal situation and the ideal way to respond to a not great event.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, there's a couple of things here. And one is, hopefully we're not just on the back foot. Hopefully we've done some planning ahead of time. But if you do find yourself on that back foot, it's going to require a little bit more scramble when you get into that moment. But the principles of responding to a crisis remain the same. We really lean in on transparency. Transparency is number one when it comes to responding to crisis. We have to be honest. We have to be honest about what we know and what we don't know. And oftentimes in a crisis situation, in those very early moments, we know something has happened, but we can't say very much because we don't know. And we also want to make sure that we're not putting misinformation out there. And so really identifying what we can say and providing a clear timeline of when we'll provide more information, what the process is going to be while we figure out exactly what's going on, but being transparent. I cannot underscore that enough. From there, then we talk about authenticity, accountability, and speed to action. And if we break those down, authenticity, we've all heard it before where somebody comes on, they're addressing it, and it sounds like it came straight out of a brochure or it was straight out of a recording. We've heard those before. And our first thought is, they don't mean it, or that was such a canned response. And we don't trust it. And we've been trained, we really have been trained to be skeptical of the responses that come out in times of crisis. It's incredibly important beyond that transparency that we are having that conversation, authentic conversations with our stakeholders. And that conversation starts internally with our employees, with our dancers, with our board members, with any of those stakeholders. We must be having those conversations there because they're also going to be our ambassadors and the voices that are going out into the community. So if we're not providing them with honest information, keeping them abreast of how we're addressing the situation and coming back to them, circling back and fulfilling our word of making sure we are keeping them informed, then what happens is if somebody goes out into the community and says, hey, I heard this from your organization. I know you work there. What do you have to say? And if those messages don't line up, we've lost that transparency, we've lost that accountability or the perception of that. And very quickly, things can spiral downhill. So it's very important that we're honest, transparent, and then authentic. And that leads me to the accountability portion as well. And I mentioned coming back to it. Whatever we say we're going to do, we have to do that. And so part of that is not overpromising from the beginning. Talk to what you can. Here's where we are, here's what we're going to do, and here's when we're coming back to you with more information. That way you do have an opportunity to figure out what the situation is, what you're legally able to communicate. Sometimes you can't legally communicate everything right away, but you can follow up with it. So it allows you to figure those things out so that you can come back and fulfill that promise to your constituents. Yeah, absolutely.
Please go ahead. When you're talking about transparency, one of the things that I think you probably may not realize, but how radical that idea is in the dance world, but particularly in the ballet world, where it's always been extremely hierarchical. I know of at least two major companies where the development director wasn't allowed to see the entire budget, where the artistic director wasn't looking at the budget. So information is shared piecemeal and siloed. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about what the downside is of that from a communications perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we always recommend in a crisis is to bring together your crisis management team. And when we look at a crisis management team, that brings in everyone from financial side, HR side, operations, the day-to-day execution, who's overseeing those aspects. And forgive me, I don't know all of my performing arts terms, but really bringing in somebody from every key team as well as legal. And the reason that we do that is for exactly what you just said. If we don't have the entire picture, if we don't understand the full situation, you don't fully understand the crisis. And if we don't fully understand the crisis situation and our response, it is very hard to be authentic and it's very hard to be accountable. And the last thing you want to have when you're going through a crisis situation and responding to a crisis is have more self-inflicted surprises come up. We want to know the lay of the land. We want to know what can we and can we not. And that's oftentimes where legal will help us with that as well. But we want to know what are those secrets in the closet. And hopefully there aren't any. But sometimes it's a matter of we did this or we made this decision and it was well intended, but we didn't realize the ramifications that could come out of it. But we have to have those hard conversations. We have to go through it so that we can be honest, we can be authentic, and we can make sure that whatever that solution is we get to, that it truly is a solution that's set up for progress or for to resolution, whatever the case may be, that we truly are able to move forward with that. Because if it's only part of it, we're not really moving forward. We're not really putting ourselves in a better position for the future. And that can be painful, but it allows us to make sure that we are moving in the right direction.
Yeah. So the interesting thing for me, obviously, as I've explained to you, I was involved in crisis communications. I do have a legal background. Is a couple of things. First of all, even assuming that everybody is on the same page, what they hear in the story may be different. So I think it's really important, first of all, as you said, to get everybody in the room, but also to understand that it's almost impossible to completely put a lid on situations nowadays with social media, et cetera. So information is going to get out there. The worst situations I ran into are when people assumed that they could control the narrative by simply saying no comment or stuffing it down. There's a long history in the not-for-profit world, as I'm sure you're aware, particularly in the performing arts, of private agreements. Somebody does something bad, there's a study undertaken. Usually the results are not made public, and then it's usually the male CEO or artistic director who is let go with pay, et cetera, and it's sort of all swept under the rug. I think those days are beginning to be over, but even assuming that best intentions are involved, one of the things I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is how many different voices are out there, the role of social media, and how that can affect things, because social media works really quickly, for good and for ill.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are a couple of thoughts that came to mind as you were describing that, Liza. One is that if it bleeds, it leads has never been more true than it is today. We are just where we are, whether it's from the financial pressures that are on the media or the fact that, as you alluded to, everybody is a reporter, everybody is a journalist and has the ability to mass communicate a message, whether it is true or whether it is their perception. We have that ability through social media now as well. So as a result of that, it is a matter of, are you really going to be able to control and organize exactly what message is coming out on every single channel if you're not giving that full story, if you're not engaging? And so what we talk about oftentimes is when we're going in, if you don't enter the conversation, if you choose the ostrich, if you will, and put your head in the sand, others are going to communicate that for you. And they're going to go out and they're going to fill in the blanks, because our minds like to have it. We like the full story. We like to know what's happening. So if we don't hear from you, our minds naturally start filling those in. By engaging in the conversation, even if it's just saying, here's what I can tell you today, and I will follow up at this time, we start to build that trust again, that we can trust that you're going to communicate with us. It doesn't mean we're on board with everything that's happening yet, but at least we're going to turn to you as a valuable resource versus just looking to piece that together. With social media, as you mentioned before, social media is something where you may think that you've talked to everybody who has been touched by this situation, or that you have the policy in place that, well, there's a policy that says nobody's going to speak, so therefore nobody's going to speak.
Yes.
That is a lot of faith and a lot of reliability on that trust that you put out there. It's not something, just to the same point, then when we say no comment does not mean that something can't show up. And it doesn't mean that it won't. It's entirely possible it will be respected, but we can't guarantee that. If we say something, we have to anticipate that it could be out there and that it could get there. And so I would say the same thing with social media. Even when you have a policy in place, we have to expect that people are going to talk. So by going out, leading the conversation, making sure that we are putting actionable steps in place to do better, to fix the situation, and we are sharing that so that people are aware versus wondering what's happened, is really, really critical.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, being a board member myself, and I'm in my 60s, and I'm very often one of the youngest board members, particularly in performing arts organizations, some of the social service organizations that my husband and I are involved in. We're kind of in the middle, but you may have board members who are longtime loyalists of the company or the venue or whatever it is, the school, and they don't know anything about social media, and I can totally respect that, and they've decided that they're not going to learn, so they may not be seeing what's happening, and the sort of groundswell, or even how social media works to create and build a narrative or a story. So I think that's something that is probably particular to performing arts board members. They think, oh, I love the opera. Oh, I love the ballet. Oh, I love the theater, and I'm going to come in and I'm going to go to these meetings and I'm going to see my friends, and then they can get sideswiped. So put yourself in a new board member's shoes. What would you be looking for in terms of planning, et cetera, crisis, or even in a candidate's shoes? If you're thinking about taking a senior leadership position, what would you be looking for?
Yes. Well, there's a couple of different questions there. If you're in the board member shoes and you're looking at an organization, one, take a thorough look across the board. Ask those tough questions. What are those things that keep the current leadership up at night? But also looking at all the way down to the performer level as well. Talk to them. What is happening in this organization? What are they most proud of? What are they most concerned about? What are those elements? Is this an organization that has put time and effort into planning for crisis, that has a protocol in place, that has a crisis management team? Have they taken the steps that are needed to make sure that if something happens, we're going to be upfront, we're going to be transparent, and we're going to take action? Look at those elements. On the social media side, it doesn't mean you have to engage to be able to see what's out there and to see how the organization is performing or using the platforms. And I think that is really important. Oftentimes people presume that if they have to be very familiar and they have to have their profile and they have to be right. That's not true. You can still see what's out there. Take a look at some of the harder or more controversial posts. What was our reaction? Did we clam up or did we address it? Did we invite a conversation? Oftentimes it'll be inviting a conversation offline. It doesn't mean it all has to play out in the public eye,
Right.
but are we acknowledging? Are we acknowledging, and just what is that interaction? So I think that is very, very important.
Okay, so let's do best case first. Okay. Imagine the perfect scenario. Maybe you've had a client go through this. Let's start with right away, sort of a situation, a thing happens. How do you identify, and then what would be best case? And I'm assuming, and we can talk about all the pre-planning that we hope would have already taken place.
Yeah. First and foremost, bring that crisis management team together, and you need to assess the situation, find out what do we know today. And from that, as you go through, there will become a list of questions of what do we not know, but what do we need to find out? So who are those that are impacted? What exactly happened? Where is our source of information coming from? Have we received any media calls to date? Has anything posted on social media? As much as you can find out about the lay of the land first. And as you mentioned, we'll talk about the planning, and hopefully we've done some planning. But regardless, have that information first and set a timeline. Especially when crisis first hits and you're identifying, are we still building or are we looking at the recovery process? Where are we in this crisis? We want to make sure we have recurring meetings set up too. It's not one and done. We meet, everybody disperses, does their thing, and the crisis is over. Come back. So if it's in the morning, come back at midday, circle back. What's the progress? What do we know now? Making sure we have those components. What's our message? And we start to do the messaging in that first meeting, but oftentimes we need to learn a little bit more is generally what happens in that first meeting. It's what do we know? What do we need to know? And it's more that second meeting when we come back and we have a bit more information that we can start to say, okay, here's what we know today. Here's our message. And it may be that right now it's our commitment. Here's our commitment as an organization. Here's our policies. And we are working on getting more information. It might also be, here's what we know as of now. And so that will change depending on the crisis, but you start to have those core messages that everybody across that crisis management team is using. It's also your time when you start to identify who's the right spokesperson for this. And that's not always your top official. And we have a tendency to say, okay, top official, you're going to be the spokesperson. That might be true, but it may not be. It really depends on the situation. And it'll both depend on the situation and their role and their engagement. I would also say it depends on what the situation is and whether or not it's something that they can relate to or they have a close relationship to the audience that's impacted. We have to look at all of those different factors. And in some cases, it sounds like for many of these situations, we're talking about really serious issues. And so we are going to be looking at more senior leaders, even if it's not the senior leader. In some cases, if it's a more minor crisis, we might be looking for somebody who's a little bit further down the stream, but has a really close connection either with the impacted audience or really understands operations or really understands if it is that natural disaster, some component of how that's impacting our business. So really identifying based on the situation.
I'm interested because you said we at a certain point, you also said team.
Yes.
Crisis management team, and then spokesperson. So that implies a level of organization and preparedness that I think a lot of tiny little DDP does have it. And we review our protocols constantly, every 6 months, et cetera, and who's the best spokesperson and who gets to speak to the media. But talk a little bit about that. And then the other thing that I was hearing, crisis or not, or successfully resolve crisis or not, is this takes a ton of time.
Yes, it absolutely does.
And a lot of people in the room.
Absolutely. That is a really important part, is the team factor. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the really important reasons, when we think about the team, when you go into crisis, no matter what the type of crisis is, the emotions are higher. The adrenaline starts to rise. There's so many different things. The stakes are higher. All of these things that just, no matter who you are, and you could be a very polished professional who has studied crisis for a very long time, the way that we act when we were planning and we were outside of crisis and our ability to think and process is different. Most of the time, that is different than the way that our minds operate and when we process when we're under that level of pressure. So there are a number of reasons for a team, but if for no other reason, it gives you others to help you think, to help question, to push, to look at, are we thinking of everything? Is this the right way? We don't just rely on what we know, because oftentimes a crisis requires the brains of everyone. It requires that experience. You mentioned that you have a law degree, so being able to pull from that. Perhaps I can pull from another crisis that I've worked on, or I might know the channels differently, and it's a crisis that erupted on social media. Whichever the case, we bring those different experiences, and we also bring our understandings of the organizations and perhaps our different relationships within the organization to the table as well. And all of those things are going to help you make a more thorough and more long-lasting process or solution for the situation as well, that's much more likely to be effective. It also allows us to get in time. So you'll have the media spokesperson, but you might need other spokespeople to speak to your different stakeholders, and the ability to act quickly and get to them if you have a team is going to expedite that as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking of so many of the small companies I know, or even the big companies dealing with the pandemic. And as we all know, region by region, state by state, organization by organization, the protocols were different. The explanation is different. What's going to happen to the programming? What's going to happen to the dancers or the people in the theater and the affected audiences? So let's go back, since we're doing it the right way, and tell me what sort of preparation that looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming that it could be, quote, crisis could be anything. What are the steps to get an organization to be able to respond in a timely and effective manner?
Absolutely. It comes down to a crisis management playbook is where it doesn't matter whether you are a Fortune 500 company or you are a smaller nonprofit organization, have your playbook. And for all of those reasons we talked about before, both knowing what's coming or being able to plan as much as you can, but also so that when you are under pressure, you have a guide to look at as a starter. So when we do that, first, we bring that team together. We think about who is on that crisis management team, and it might not be officially on the paper yet. Hopefully it will by the end of the meeting, but you bring that team together. Who are those key stakeholders? Make sure the leadership's in the room for that meeting as well. Sometimes these crisis management meetings start with a group And then they don't bring in the top officials.
Yep.
Well, if you don't have that top buy-in when the crisis actually hits, it really scraps the rest of your planning. So make sure the leadership is in the room as well. When you get everybody in the room, the first question that I ask everybody is, what keeps you up at night? What could happen tomorrow that you're most worried about? And normally it's also, if they don't respond there, it's, what's the worst thing that could happen to this company or this organization tomorrow? And get them to start talking about that. And what you'll find is there will be some overlap. You'll also see that there's a little bit of difference as you go around the room. Operations might say something very different than those who are working with the performers, or your board might have a different perspective. So talking to each of them and finding out what those items are. Normally we'll do this on a whiteboard. So we'll start listing them out on the whiteboard. And then from there, then we'll go through and we'll prioritize what are the most significant, excuse me, or the most likely to happen. And we start to work through those. We also talk at that point, what do we want to be known for? And even in the midst of crisis, what do we want people to know about our organization and about our approach or our response to crisis? And that's often where we start with when we do messaging. So we'll have our overarching, here's who we are and how we want to be seen messaging. But then we take those scenarios that we built out and we built out essentially a playbook for each of those, a starting point. And I would love to say that I have the perfect scenario for every crisis. The reality is they never hit.
Nope.
They never hit exactly the way we planned them to be. We had influenza. We did not see global pandemic, right? So there are fluctuations that are there. But the idea being, when you have, here's a potential scenario, and here are kind of quick start items. We need messaging. Here are our audiences. Right off the top, we know these different audiences are going to be ones that we need to communicate with directly. We know that we are currently communicating with them with these channels. Do we have an email for them, or is it a phone call? What is our way of being able to reach them quickly? And then we start working on placeholder statements as well. And those statements, again, they're not going to be perfect. They will need to be tweaked. But when you have that pressure and it's trying to think through, what's my next step, to be able to pull up a draft holding statement. So that statement that says, just beginnings with, whether we are heartbroken or currently we are aware of this situation, whatever that is, to have that starter placeholder message so that it's a place for you to start writing from. That will kickstart the development and help you stay ahead of the crisis when the crisis does actually come up.
So this assumes, by the way, that, because I've seen this work and then I've seen it not work. So I'm going to push you a little here, because we all live in the real world. What if you have people who are blockading, who want to keep all the information to themselves? Or I'm sure you and I have been in the room with people who think they're smarter than the press, and they're going to be able to talk around it or ignore it or whatever. Or what if you have some board members who think this is a worthwhile exercise and needs to be done, and others who don't? Because you can't assume an organization, everybody's moving in the same direction at the same time. How do you cope with that?
Yeah. Well, on your crisis management team, there should be a lead. Who's the official? Who's the final say? And that is really important to have within a CMT, a crisis management team, because at the end of the day, there are going to be different opinions. And it could be a natural disaster. It could be an earthquake. Nobody could have changed the fact that there was an earthquake coming, but how we decide to react to that, that's where the opinions come in. And so we have all of the data, we're bringing it to the table. I would encourage anyone who's in these situations, it can be easy to sit back and say, okay, I brought my piece forward, somebody pushed me, but I did my piece. If you see a red flag, if you see, hey, as an organization, we are about to walk into a trap, or we are about to walk into something that we see the freight train coming and we have a choice, speak up. Speak up. Don't be afraid to say that. It is important to be able to have that conversation. And yet at the end of the day, we need that final person who has the authority to do that and make that final call. That is important to have in those situations as well. Just ultimately.
Okay, if you don't, how have you dealt with that in the past, right? If you don't have that one person and everybody's like, yes, you're the leader, and yes, we agree, and they follow. How do you manage? How do you herd cats? Some very big cats, maybe some like tigers and lions, etc. I'm trying to get into the real world reality here of what it looks like with fractious boards, some of whom may be in their 90s and have known the organization for 50 years and sort of have that ownership, and some new people who are pushing for more transparency. When you're hired and you come into that situation, what do you do? Because you
Sure.
can't just say one person's the leader and that's the way it's going to be.
Sure. No, absolutely. Data is data and information. The more information we can bring to the table is often very important in those situations and oftentimes when we don't have that consensus, if you will, it's because those emotions are really strong, or it'll be a matter of somebody saw something, or their grandchild saw something on social media, and therefore it must be everywhere. We get that one a lot. If there's one post out there, clearly everybody has seen it. And so in those cases, oftentimes it's looking at what's worked in the past, being able to talk to examples. Here's why we do this. Here's why we come back to the playbook.
That's what I was looking at, is bringing to the table, this is what could happen to us.
Here's why
we get a plan in place, etc.
Yes.
So not every organization, and as a matter of fact, the overwhelming majority of organizations are quite small. I was referencing Advanced Data Project before. I really, having done this, but also I want to be prepared. We've really thought through with our board members and our team members, not every single crisis scenario, but who talks when.
Yes.
What I'm hearing from you is it takes time, it takes coordinated effort, it takes the board being willing to do it, but it doesn't necessarily take a huge amount of money. Am I correct?
Correct. That's correct. Absolutely. And the planning for this can be a wide scale. We've worked with organizations where we go through that excuse me, that planning process. We have that guide and we use that to move forward. We work with other organizations. You did that entire guide, and then we run drills and we pull together the whole team and we play it out as though it's really happening. And we go through that and we take a whole afternoon or a whole day to be able to do those. Media training is another one. If you're an organization that can invest a little bit to do media training, big, small, otherwise, I do believe that that is a very important factor, because if you find yourself in a situation where you're speaking to the media, if it's not your first time doing it, if it's not your first time in that position, you're going to be better positioned to be able to communicate those messages.
And even DDP, with our very small budget, every single member of our team and every single member of our board gets media trained, because I believe it and I think it's so important. Also, it really teaches folks that it's much harder than it looks.
Indeed.
It really is. And I've done it for years and I go, So we've talked about how things look when things are going well. You don't have to give me the client name or anything else, but give me an example of things going wrong.
Yes.
And what happens?
Yeah. I think one example that comes to mind is every once in a while, there's the hesitancy to engage. I want to watch. And I'm not saying that we don't want to do that. There absolutely are times where we need to watch a little bit. And certainly this depends on which crisis it is. But sometimes it's a matter of, let's see, is this an internal crisis where we just need to talk to our people internally, make a plan internally, or is this something that's already external and we need to engage externally? So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to decide that as you're going through. Now, if you are watching, that doesn't mean you just sit back and do nothing. We should be getting our messages in place. We should be having those holding statements. We should have a unified, okay, if this happens, this is our go point in which we are going to engage. Yep. You don't just sit and then 3 days later say, okay, now it's getting bad. What are we going to do? Right. And because then you're already behind it. So one, looking at those elements and making sure you're being proactive. And we always say the best use of pre-planning or crisis planning preparation is the one that we never have to use. We plan so that hopefully we never have to use it. That is the goal of doing that plan. But in the event that it does come up, we want to be ready for it. Now, there are times when people choose not to engage and it starts to fester. And you start seeing people will then start putting their own perceptions of what happened or what didn't happen, and you'll start getting all sorts of comments out there, a source close to, or rumor has it, or according to clients, or you'll start to hear those types of elements. That is the crisis taking on a life of its own, and the crisis will continue to evolve. It doesn't just stop because others have then jumped in with their feedback. That at that point, we absolutely, if you haven't already, we need to be communicating and figuring out the best way to do that. But how do you make sure that you are being transparent, that you are on those channels, and that you are having that conversation and welcoming the opportunity to be part of it, so it doesn't look like we're hiding from it? Because if it looks like you're hiding from it, even if it's just, I don't know how to respond, if it looks like you're choosing not to engage, we perceive that as guilt.
Yeah, and we've also, I'm sure you've had it, and I've had it, is you're dealing with people who don't want to tell the entire truth, and you can't directly confront somebody and say you're lying or you're hiding something. All you can do is sort of lay out, here's what could happen,
Mhm.
um, which is a difficult situation to be in, but it sometimes does happen. The other
Yeah.
thing I wanted to talk about, sort of as our last point, is one of the things that comes up over and over, whether it's the pandemic or the
Mhm.
loss of a leader or scandal, is how taxing it is on the emotions.
Yes.
And particularly for a board member or a staff member who, thought they were being hired for this. And I'm thinking of the pandemic in particular, 18 months later, you're still slogging through the trenches. In some cases, you don't know what's going to happen in the organization. I think as leadership, telling people you are going to need to manage your emotions. This may not be resolved next week. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Absolutely. That is an excellent point. Crisis is exhausting. It's exhausting no matter what your role is in managing through a crisis. And there's that adrenaline rush that does hit. And sometimes there's a bit of the energy that comes off of that. But a crisis is a cycle from the moment it happens to whether or not it escalates where you are to the recovery process of a crisis. It takes time. And if you are an individual who truly cares about the organization, truly cares about what you are doing and the reputation of the organization, that's going to be emotionally exhausting as well.
Yep.
And oftentimes there's vulnerability in crisis. And to your point of what do we say or how much do we say? Oftentimes that's a matter of, okay, it could be I made a decision because I believed it was the right decision, or I hired this person because I believed they were a good person and they were going to do good things for the organization. And to admit that we made a mistake or this did not work out the way that we intended it to be, that's a very vulnerable position. But what we do see is if we are transparent, if we are honest about that, if we make those statements, not just that, hey, policy is this, they check these boxes, therefore we're not responsible. That sounds very much like I'm putting a guard up and saying, this is not my problem, versus putting the heart into it and saying, we believe this and our intent was this.
Yep.
And owning the pieces that you can own. It doesn't mean you have to own everything, but owning the pieces you can own that were your responsibility. Your audiences, I think you will be surprised how much your audiences will relate and respect you more, even though it's a very hard spot to be.
Yeah. We've only got a couple of minutes left. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is sort of in the fog of war, in the fury of it, or being sort of an analogy. A lot gets lost. So one of the things that I've always recommended folks do is sit down and do a what we learned or sort of a summary, particularly because with staff transitioning in and out, the people who are on the crisis team may not still be there 12 months later. If you could just speak to that, just super short, that'd be great.
The debrief is very important as well. Make sure you take time to debrief what worked, what didn't work, what did we wish we would have had in terms of tools available, and don't just talk about it, go through it, talk about it, and then write it down. Update your plan and make sure you have that log for the future.
Because I think there's so much that is lost, not just with staff changes, but 5 weeks later, even you don't even remember. And sometimes people just want to forget about it because it's been so hard.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this, Shannon Riggs. I appreciate it so much. Hugely important subject that I don't think gets addressed enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liza. Appreciate the time.